My video today is entitled The 7 Faces of Shame, Bringing Light to Darkness through the advanced application of Lajjitaadi Avasthas. And in this video, I'm going to be exploring what shame is. And then also we're going to review how this constellation is constructed in a person's chart, and then look at the unique qualities of these 7 faces of shame. We're going to finish up by examining some specific shame Lajjitaadi Avasthas with the use of karakas or indicators, and some closing thoughts on how to benefit from this constellation if you have it in your chart, how to help your clients work with it, and what might be the purpose of having this in your chart. So let's begin by examining what is shame. Wikipedia defines shame as an unpleasant self-conscious emotion typically associated with a negative evaluation of the self, withdrawal motivations, and feelings of distress, exposure, mistrust, powerlessness, and worthlessness. And I like this definition for our presentation today because I think that second dot point, the withdrawal motivations, that there's something about shame. What's so violent about that experience is actually that it shuts the person off from other people. So whatever it is that we feel ashamed of, we want to keep that hidden from others. So we know it, we feel like it's a flaw, a real black mark. It makes us doubt ourselves. It's something very vulnerable. But as if that wasn't bad enough, the only strategy available with shame is to hide it from others, to try to protect our image out there in the world that we're a functional, competent human being, and keep this hidden secret to the self. And when I was doing the Lajjitaadi Avasthas table last video, I was at the beginning of that wondering, how are these Avasthas ordered, like in severity? You know, obviously proud is really good. We're pretty good about that. Delighted is, not quite as good as proud, but, still really good. But then once you get to starved and agitated and shamed, which of those is really the most violent or the most destructive or, inverted commas, the worst? And it seemed to me in the definitions, and we'll have a look at this later in the presentation, of how they're formed, it was quite obvious that the shamed Avasthas came last. It was the most severe or the most damaging. And that's a point of contention that I look forward to hearing your thoughts on. But for me, like, my hint when I was putting that together was that, wow, the violence that one causes to oneself must be karmically the worst violence. And isn't that interesting? Because right next door is agitated, right? And agitated, often we think of being, violent, like actually causing violence to another person, because we project out, there's just this extra irritation and extra frustration, and we project it out onto those people around us, and it comes out. But isn't it interesting that perhaps even that violent karma of acting out on someone else is actually less violent than withdrawing oneself from the connectedness? So I find that a fascinating aspect of shame, and why it's so toxic for a person and so damaging. It also makes me think, when we talk about, what is shame, we have to go back to these mythological stories, and there's a great one in the Genesis story that after God has created the earth and populated the earth with plants and animals and this human man, and created a companion for this man named Eve, Adam and Eve. And it's complete. It's like the end of the 6 days of creation. God's about to have a rest day because creation is complete and it's perfect. And how is that generally translated and passed down to us in this story? And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So right there, in this core mythology of Christianity, which infiltrates so much of Western thought and the cultures that have led to Western thought and philosophy, is this idea that when creation was perfect and finished, the humans were naked and not ashamed. And this article that I've pulled this from makes a very good point that we could use anything there. The man and the wife were both naked and happy, or both naked and confident, or both naked and excited to explore creation. There's so many ways that sentence could be finished, and yet here's this ashamed word right here at the start of this creation story. So I think this is a powerful concept for those of us that have grown up with this mythology, is that shame is something really core to our relationship with ourself and with our spirituality. And it's right there in this original book. Then, of course, these days one cannot speak about shame without speaking of Brené Brown. And I was vaguely aware of her, but I found Brené Brown after I did my first videos with Ryan, which you may have seen. And of course, as soon as I did that, I felt completely embarrassed and ashamed, and was hoping that the file would get deleted and would never get posted on the internet. So I'm thinking about it, and what do I look up on the internet? Who do I find? Brené Brown, who's got a very famous TED Talk on shame, which I recommend if anybody wants to learn about shame and how it really feels. It's a great video. But she's quite famous for this kind of quote: shame needs 3 things to grow: secrecy, silence, and judgment. Shame cannot grow or thrive in a context of empathy. And this is why I think astrology has a lot to offer in this area of shame, because astrology is a great way to bring light to the darkness. And you saw that there in the title of my video today. I think astrology is excellent at defining this experience and at showing the main actors that are creating this experience inside the person, and therefore giving the person awareness and the ability to make conscious decisions of what they do with their behavior. Now, a couple of other things I wanted to add into this definition. The remarkable thing about shame is that it's a feeling that you have all by yourself. You actually don't have to have done anything wrong. You could have had a thought that you think is wrong. No one has heard that thought. You haven't acted upon it, but the mere act of having that thought creates in you this feeling of shame that you withdraw that part of yourself from the rest of humanity. You don't connect yourself fully. That's like a classic version of shame. Whereas, for example, guilt, you actually have to have done something, right? and you feel guilty about the action, something outside of yourself. Whereas with shame, you feel shamed of yourself. So not something you did, but it's you. There's something flawed or wrong that if people knew what it was, you would be ostracized. So shame, guilt, and of course embarrassment is another emotion, feeling in that zone, but embarrassment involves people witnessing you. You know, you have to be embarrassed by being seen by people, and they're seeing you do something that you decide is shameful or that you feel is not good, and then you're embarrassed. But with shame, it can happen completely inside yourself. So that's a really important aspect of shame. But another really fascinating aspect of shame is that actually someone can violate you and you feel shame. So if someone does something wrong to you, it's like they're the ones who broke any kind of, laws or morals or anything. They did the action. But because it was to you or to your body, you feel violated and you feel shame that has happened. And you feel that you're flawed inside, and so you're cutting off from the rest of humanity, from that connected flow of good feeling of being alive, because someone has violated you. So I think it's an important thing to keep in mind with shame that, one, it can happen by yourself entirely, not from doing any actions. And two, it can happen not by you doing anything wrong, but by something wrong being done to you. For example, just to make that more clear in case I'm not communicating that well, for example, children who are abused or actually sexual abuse, non-consensual sex where maybe the person hasn't quite articulated they didn't want to, allows it to happen and then feels this shame that this has happened to them, even though they haven't actually done anything. Or even I'm reading in the press this week about some strip searches that were done to Australian women on an Emirates flight or something. So you can imagine this situation where the authorities have the authority to do strip searches because of some, reason. Let's hope that there was a reason. And they do this search to you, and then you are sitting on the plane for 8 hours flying somewhere after this has happened, and inside of yourself you feel shame that you've been violated. You can feel that feeling, but you haven't actually done anything wrong. And in fact, the other person may not have in this case, or the other person in this case may have abused their authority. I have no idea of the actual context, but I think it's a good example of how shame operates, that it's not necessarily about an action that you did. And then finally, a powerful thing that we have to say about shame is it is somatic inside yourself. You feel the sensations inside your own body. There's a pattern for you that's unique to you that as soon as that somatic sensation, frequency, whatever you want to describe, that happens, you feel shame. And it's not logical, it's not verbal, it's instant, and it's at that visceral level. So these are some definitions of shame. I wanted to just explore a little bit more the shame and darkness, because I do feel this is where astrology can help so much. So sometimes what can happen with that feeling of shame, maybe especially if this happens to you as a younger person, that one has this unpleasant experience, right? That's what the Wikipedia definition I love. It's an unpleasant feeling. We all know it's unpleasant. About shame, perhaps as a child you actually get shamed as a way of scolding you about something, or other things happen, but from this somatic experience in the body, that is something that you do not want to feel again. It's really something you can't do anything with, but it's yucky. And it's like we put it in a chest. We just want to lock it away. Let's never have that experience again, because exploring it does not seem to help, and it just seems to relive it. Like you can't exhaust the shame that is available from that particular memory. So we had this idea to lock it up in a chest, and we try to bury it, in an attic, because even not locking it up isn't even enough. We want to get it out of the main part of where we think about ourselves and our identity and who we are and how we feel about ourselves. We want to put it in the furthest back corner of the attic. We want to cover it in lots of different other stuff that's there so that we could forget about it. It's so that it won't be triggered again. And even that doesn't work. And, eventually we're like locking it behind a door, in the attic at the top of the stairs. And then, even the house is getting tainted. We're locking the door to the house. We try to get away from this feeling of shame, but it's so somatic that it is instantly accessible. It doesn't matter if you've put it in a chest in the attic behind a closed door. Someone says that keyword, you see something that reminds you of that situation, you meet someone that reminds you of that situation, and boom, you're having this experience. So it's very disempowering because it takes over your somatic experience of yourself, and there's really nothing that you can do with it apart from hope that it's going to pass and that you will never have to experience it again. So we really want to do something with this. Let's see if we can do something with this in the video. So how does all this compare to the shamed Lajjitaadi Avasthas? You guys will remember this from the previous video, my second Year 4 video. It's a decision tree for helping us work out, when we're looking at those planets laid out in a chart, which Lajjitaadi Avasthas are actually being created, because there can be many happening to the same planet and to all the planets. So you need to have a clear process to work out all the different Avasthas that are going on. It starts on the right with proud, then delighted, then starved, and then agitated. And then here we get to the missing links, which is what we're going to examine today. In order for it to be a shamed Lajjitaadi Avasthas, we need the planet in question to be conjunct Sun, Mars, or Saturn. And what are these guys? These are the pure malefics. They are, you know how Mercury can be malefic if it's with a malefic, and the moon can be malefic if it's waning. But these guys, no matter what, this is their core business, is being challenging and demanding that we find the best in ourselves. So we need the Sun, Mars, or Saturn. And we either need for it to be in the 5th house, that is, the planet that you're interested in is with the Sun, Mars, or Saturn in the 5th house. So you're looking at 2 planets in the 5th house. Or you need the Sun, Mars, or Saturn with the planet that you're interested in and a node, Rahu or Ketu, in any house. That is what is going to give you a shamed Avasthas. And what does this tell us? I think this shares with us a couple of important things. One is those pure malefics, what do they have in common? It's the kashta. That malefic planets give out their kashta. And this is really important to creating that experience of one splitting from connecting to humanity, from feeling open and from feeling that life is flowing through you. This kashta that the malefic planets give out so freely is important to creating this splitting off from the flow of life. And then we can see that the other thing is important is either the 5th house or a node. And what do we know about that? The 5th house is about taking our lives in the direction that we've consciously decided to go. Not what we inherited when we stepped onto the planet, but it's our path. So that is a great area for shame because we're not doing it for anybody else. You know, that is the 5th house. That is the path we're following based on our learnings from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th house from that if we talk about the hero's journey from arriving, first house, second house, gathering resources, third house, testing out our skills, gaining courage and confidence, fourth house, setting up stability somewhere, creating a home. Now, from that initial path, 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth house is where we launch and make the path our own for the first time. We take everything that we have learned and gathered and built in the direction that we choose and we want to go. So, great place to feel shame. Totally, fifth house belongs to us. Or it needs to be with a node. And the nodes are so unpredictable. They're like Alice through the looking glass. There's something where they just twist the light in such a way that it creates magic. And they are guiding us towards this evolutionary journey that is beyond our lifetime. So what the fifth house and the nodes have in common is this driving my life thing. And when I drive my life and I make a mistake and the kashta comes to get me, this is where shame is created. So, what about the 7 faces of shame? Now, why I think this is really important is because if we go back to the image we were looking at before of the chest, buried at the back of the attic, locked at the top of the stairs in an abandoned house, in a neighborhood that we grew out of and that we never go back to, is that we try to put so much distance between ourselves and the causes of triggering this shame that we forget what it is that the shame was even about. Because we want to forget the address of this shame. It's just horrible. The whole thing is horrible. So anything that was related to the creation of that experience, we just reject, forget, bury. And I totally get that strategy. But the only trouble is, after a period of time, we're still getting this shame triggered, as we discussed, somatically it's just going to go pop every time. But we have forgotten what constitutes, what is it that was so horrible about this, because we've tried to distance ourselves and cover it in so many layers of excuses and reframing and recontextualizing so that we are separated from this experience. And we can't unpick it anymore. It's just yuck, It's like sludge, but you can't tell the ingredients. I think astrology adds so much value because it tells us the ingredients. It delineates exactly what is going into that experience for a person. And that helps them be empowered because now as an adult, they can have some distance from those elements of the recipe and maybe constitute that recipe in a slightly different way, gain some skills and get better and better. But first of all, we have to be able to identify what these different shames feel like. So, what does it feel like when the sun is shamed? It's going to be about one's inspirations. The sun is our calling to greatness. It's our vision. And when we are shamed, when the sun is shamed, there is something innately wrong for us about our inspirations and our vision. It's going to affect our consistency, and we're going to have that experience that when I really say what is my vision, I get shamed. So it splits someone from their own vision. With the moon, this is going to happen around emotions. The person is going to feel there is something wrong with their emotions. And we're going to examine each of these in a bit more detail. With Mars, it's the shame around actions or being futile, not having taken the actions that I should have. So that's like that weak point to shame Mars. With Mercury, it's hard to find one word to describe Mercury because Mercury connects everything. And that's why I've gone with facilitation. Mercury wants to make things easy. It wants to make communication easy. It wants to make the truth easy. It wants to make connections easy. That it wants to manage everything so life is facilitated. And if there is something that Mercury has done that becomes an obstruction, that is just the antithesis of Mercury, and it's going to cut right to that shame. With Jupiter, it's being shamed for one's goodness or not living up to one's goodness. This is the kryptonite for Jupiter. For Venus, it's our desires that are going to cause shame. Maybe this is the shame that many of us can relate to, classic shame. And with Saturn, it's our flaws that are going to lead us to feel shamed. Let's take these 7 faces of shame one by one. When the sun is shamed, a person is going to feel that if they follow their own inspiration, they will be shamed. They can feel shame from not meeting ideals, or shame from lacking the self-esteem to enjoy success. They may feel that their own inspirations can never be enough. Let's have a look at an example because this helps us to understand these things, put some meat on the bones. Here we have John Lennon's chart, and you can see the ascendant there in Aries with K2, Saturn and Jupiter in Taurus, coming round for Venus in Virgo, and then you'll notice we have the Sun with Rahu with Mars in the 7th house of Libra. We've got Mercury in the 8th house and the Moon in the 11th house. But let's go back to that 7th house, because right there we see the shamed Avasthas, because we have a planet with the Sun, we have the planet with Mars, in this case it's both ways, and we have a node. So we've created a shame Lajjitaadi Avasthas. And let's examine this as an example for someone who's having the Sun shamed, in this case by Mars. Now, it's so fascinating. You go on the internet and look up these things. Here you go. Did you know that the first song that John Lennon ever learned to play on the guitar was Ain't It a Shame? Just thought that was really fascinating, because he's got these two. He's got Sun being shamed by Mars and Mars being shamed by Sun. So we can say that this was an important theme in this person's life. And then from an article, this is a quote by John Lennon: "I was a hitter. I couldn't express myself and I hit. I fought men and I hit women. This violent history was why he worked to transform himself into someone who embraced peace. This is why I'm always on about peace, you see. It's the most violent people who go for love and peace." And what I think is great about this quote is here is someone who has an inspiration around peace and has actually undeniably made a contribution towards peace in this world. So that inspiration was strong for this person, and at the same time they've got this violent, explosive temper, and they hit people and they hit women, and the shame that must come from having such a pure vision and knowing that one is also violent and not able to control their own temper, let alone change the world. So I think this is a great example of the agony of this combination. And I thought it goes really well with when you think of Imagine, this hymn of peace, such a contribution to humanity's relationship with peace. And yet this hymn to peace is very gentle and soft, and actually pointing out that we already have peace right now. It's here. It's already here. And again, I thought this was a great example of Sun being shamed by Mars, because this is not a roaring call to arms peace anthem that you could imagine would provoke such a strong Mars shame response. You know, if you're going to give that much energy to this inspiration, then naturally by giving energy to that inspiration, Mars is going to have the energy to shame you about it. And yet this gentle hymn is a great way of working with Mars, because you're not even saying that anybody needs to take any action to create peace. You know, that's where we would provoke Mars into doing something. Here, this song is saying, it's already here. Imagine it. You do it. You just need to, swap the way that you think about it. So I thought that was a great example of how someone over a lifetime had learned to work with their shamed Sun without provoking Mars. What about the Moon when it's shamed? What does this type of shame feel like? The person may feel ashamed of having feelings, moods, needs, and not being as great as others. The person feels ashamed for having feelings, right? Which is the very definition of being human, is that it comes with its level of sensations and emotions. So they keep this hidden inside, this inverted commas flaw of feeling. The person needs a lot of energy to repress their feelings, and it prevents success in other areas of their life, and it cripples their ability to adapt, which is what the Moon is all about. But because they have to keep these emotions under control so they don't exist, they're using a lot of energy. Let's have a look at a chart here for Katy Perry. And we've got the ascendant there in Scorpio with a lot of action. We've got the Sun, Mercury, Saturn, Moon, and K2. So you can see straight away that this is where we're going to look for our shamed Avasthas. But just to walk around the chart, we've got Venus in Sagittarius, we've got Jupiter and Mars in Capricorn, and we have Rahu over there in Taurus. So here we have a lot of planets going on in the shamed Avasthas. But let's imagine we've got the Moon. So that's the planet that we're interested in being shamed. It's being shamed by being with K2. And we could say that it's being shamed by the Sun or by Saturn. In fact, by both. So this person's emotions, their fragility, their needs, their neediness, is being shamed by the Sun and by Saturn. And here are some quotes from Katy Perry. This is from an article. Katy Perry recalls being ashamed about taking medication for depression. Isn't that so matching the definition of what a shamed Moon feels like? As life gets real, the harder it gets to hold on to the pain that helped you create. No longer is that pain helping you create songs. So this is really interesting that a creative person is using this Avasthas to generate songs that, have become huge hits. And I used to really be able to fix my depression by just going, here's a number one. So this is the trunk in the attic with the door locked. When that gets triggered, away this person goes and creates a mega hit that distracts her from the pain that's locked in that attic. But over time, eventually, it doesn't matter, because that celebration that's happening of that number one or that single or that amazing song can't be fulfilling, because a part of the self is locked away in this attic in a trunk, this shame feeling that we don't want to access. So at some point, she takes medication and she says, I was so ashamed of taking Perry. I was like, I'm Katy Perry. I wrote Firework. I'm on medication. This is fucked up. So she's had to face her vulnerability, and it's really confronting. And I think this is a great, example of the moon, because she was using the moon, the masses, as a way to try to medicate the moon that's being shamed. But eventually, even that mass adoration was not enough to overcome this Avashta. And she succumbed to depression, which is a great example of Saturn shaming the moon, right? That heaviness of Saturn, that lack, that just depressing. No wonder you're going to feel depressed. But then, of course, this next thing, I'm Katy Perry, I wrote Firework, is also like the sun. I'm positive. I'm this enormous personality of motivation and of joy. And, that's my vision. That's what I want to contribute and what I have contributed, and yet I'm wounded. And that negates all of that vision that I've been able to share with people. So I think this quote just really sums up some of the feelings of the moon being shamed. What about when Mars is shamed? This can be the shame of futility, of not acting in an emergency situation, not being able to win. It leads to frustration and violence. One has to remember that when we're talking about Mars, we are going to be talking about Mars being in the same sign as the Sun or as Saturn in order to make this Avashta work. So you get two malefics in the same sign, it's always going to be stronger and tendency for more frustration and violence. And we have a beautiful example of John Lennon's chart that we already shared before. Now we're looking at it the other way around, that actually Mars is being shamed here by the Sun. And what do we notice? I think the Ballad of John and Yoko is just such a classic example of this Avashta playing out. So I hope you guys know this song. It's relating what happened around John and Yoko getting married. And apparently it was very spur of the moment. I think actually Paul McCartney got married or something that same week, that same day, whatever. And John suddenly has this idea. He's driving to the coast, Southampton. Oh, let's get married. And so here we go. Mars, right, wants to take action. And they apply for a license or to get married at sea or something, and they get knocked back. And they try getting married in Paris, and it can't happen. They get told they got to go to Gibraltar, and they're kind of being chased around by the paparazzi the whole time. But at the same time, this action, which, I want to marry, the woman that I love. So it's actually, it's an okay action. He's divorced, she's divorced, there's nothing actually wrong with this. From Mars's perspective, want to take action, and the Sun, the government, just cannot find any administrative authority to grant them this wedding license. So here you go, exactly. The line from the song, the man in the Mac says, you've got to go back. They didn't even give us a chance. Such a Mars kind of right and wrong thing. It wasn't even fair. And it's it's called a ballad, but it's actually really fast-paced song. You get this sense of them being chased around. And then another line from the song, Christ, it ain't easy. They're going to crucify me. And I just thought that, crucify is such a great Sun sacrifice symbology. And who is Mars? In this case, it's the ascendant lord, because we spoke about him being Aries. So he feels his Mars is being shamed here. He cannot, it's futile. He cannot marry the woman that he loves, that he's legally entitled to, she's legally entitled to. He can't make this happen. And how does he take that? They're going to crucify me. The sun is going to crucify me. Fantastic. And I thought it contrasted really nicely again with that we do learn to work with these avasthas over time. And you contrast it with this song towards just before he leaves the body, watching the wheels. And it's all about him being this house husband, looking after his son. I'm watching the wheels go round and round, so he can see that the action is taking place out there. I think he says that he just worked non-stop, like from 1961 or 2, whatever, right through to the early 70s, pumping out album after album, tour after tour, hit after hit, enormous personality, action, action, action. So Mars really driving that, sense of identity. And in this song, watching the wheels go round and round, it's like he's confronted his worst fear, which is to step back from the action. And he's actually found all this peace. So there's a beautiful contrast to the chasing, frenetic ballad of John and Yoko. Now, let's have a look at Mercury. The shame of not being able to keep it all together. Mercury just wants to manage life, to make life easy, to make life productive. And if the person cannot do that, they feel shame. And the shame of needing to ask for help, because as the manager, of course, Mercury wants to be invincible. The shame of feeling unacceptable to one's friends. Mars is really a peer of equals, wants to connect with everyone, and that shame experience we talked about right at the beginning, withdrawing, gives you this sense that you want to withdraw. Who is Mercury without his friends? And the shame of having to be right. Mercury wants to follow the truth. It wants to make it easy for the truth to be seen. And when it is being shamed, it may be because Mercury has, under pressure, lost its objectivity, and that would be shameful. Here we have a chart to look at. It's pink, and you can see the ascendant is in Sagittarius, K2 in Pisces, Moon in Aries. Mars is in Cancer, Jupiter in Leo, and then we've got a whole grab bag of planets in Virgo. We've got Rahu, Mercury, Sun, Saturn, and Venus. So we've got a lot of shamed avasthas happening here. And this was really interesting. Obviously when I'm looking for these examples, I don't know everybody's life. I put them into the database. I'm looking for, in this case, a Mercury being shamed. And this name comes up and I'm like, oh yeah, let me go research that. And I found some great material. But then when I actually look at the chart, I'm like, wow, there's a lot of this. And you'll see with several of the celebrities that I've picked that there's a lot going on. For this example, let's have a look at Mercury. We see that we've got Rahu there, so we know we're in potential shamed territory. Have we got one of those core malefic planets? Yes, we've got the Sun and we've also got Saturn. So everybody's having a bit of the action here. But let's have a look at Mercury being shamed by the Sun or Mercury being shamed by Saturn. And we've got some quotes for her here. I'm an outcast. And what a great way of saying how Mercury feels when we're unacceptable to one's friends. That she's learned to embrace that. Like, she's doing great with that. And this is my hope of the video, is looking at how we can use these in an empowering way. But that doesn't mean that as a child and young person, it was enjoyable to be an outcast, and it's a very difficult experience for Mercury to have. Here she says, it is usual that you feel vulnerable, that you feel powerless, that you feel out of control, that you feel scared. Pink says of her fights with her husband, but really I just want you to rub my tummy, so there's that real vulnerability, but there's all this powerlessness and out of control. That's a classic Mercury shame thing, right? You don't want to be out of control. Then we've got the I feel scared, really good reference to Saturn. The I feel powerless, reference to the Sun. So we're getting all of those mixed into this Avashta. I get embarrassed sometimes. I'm an oversharer. So Mercury is so much about our communication. And when we have that shamed Avashta, we say things, we share things that create shame for the self. And then from another article, she might punch you in the face. Beyond that, she's fairly harmless. And I think this is a great example that with these violent planets, the Sun and Saturn, with these malefic planets, they're actually shaming each other too. So there's a whole lot going on for this person. But that in the core of it are those mercurial, that softness. Mercury is, this soft and vulnerable planet. But it can, in order to cover the shame of Mercury, and us not wanting to feel our shame, we can have this hard exterior, especially with the planets that are involved here. And on reflecting on her own life experiences in childhood, she said, when marriages become hateful, it's pretty hard for the children, especially when they say hateful things, and anything you do can trigger that. And I thought this was another great quote around Mercury being shamed, because it's got the element of communication, which is in Mercury's ball game, but it's also got and anything you do can trigger that, meaning that this person is already trying to use Mercury to manage their life. If I can manage this situation by not saying this or not doing that or not being in this situation, then this wouldn't happen. But she can't. It says here, anything you do can trigger that. So there's like the powerlessness, because I can't manage this situation. It's unmanageable. And that's a very shaming experience for Mercury. And in the same article, I always felt like such an outcast. So just reiterating that same quote. This is maybe a core experience for the Mercury shamed Avashta. Okay, Jupiter. What does Jupiter shame feel like? Shame of not being good, of preventing oneself from doing good. Shame of appearing good but not being good. The person feels pain in expressing their heartfelt beliefs. Shame of not having something meaningful in one's life. And let's have a look at a chart for this example, keeping with the John Lennon theme. I'm going Yoko Ono here. And we've got Ascendant in Libra, Moon in Sagittarius. We've got Sun, Venus, Saturn. So we've got the Sun and Saturn together with Venus, but no nodes, not in the 5th house. Well, actually, sorry, it is in the 5th house. We do have a shaming Avashta there, but it's not the one that we're going to concentrate on. We've got Mercury, Rahu in Pisces, and then all the way around in Virgo, we've got K2, Mars, Jupiter, and that's the example that I've pulled for this case because I want to talk about Jupiter. And trying to look at this from Yoko Ono's perspective. And this is the thing about shamed Avashtas, that they're very personal, and we can look at things from the outside. What does it feel like on the inside? This is a person who was a peace activist and artist in her own right. So she's obviously motivated around changing the world, making the world a better place, doing good. that's until she meets John Lennon. That's what she's famous for. That's obviously a core calling for her. And instead of that, she becomes famous for being someone's wife, the woman who broke up the Beatles, and perhaps the most famous widow, I don't know if you want to say, of the 80s, of New York, of pop history. So here's a woman wanting to be known for her work and her contribution to improving the world, and instead her identity as a wife becomes what she's known for. So I can imagine that for Jupiter that would be a very shameful experience. And that whole woman who broke up the Beatles, bringing so much shame onto her for her relationship. And who is it? It's Mars, the sense of right and wrong, what society thinks is right and wrong, projecting onto you this thing that is shameful, that you've destroyed the most beloved, whatever, pop group of the 60s or whatever. So I think that there's a lot of complex shame in that mix. Venus and desires. This seems like maybe an obvious cause of shame. Shame of desires and passions. Just having desires is shameful. Shame of believing one doesn't deserve fulfillment. And the chart that I've chosen for this one is Ian Fleming, who wrote the James Bond 007 series. He's got an ascendant here in Aquarius with Saturn in Aries, Moon in Taurus, Sun and Mercury in Gemini, and then what we're looking for, Mars, Rahu and Venus in Cancer, Jupiter in Leo, Ketu finally in Capricorn. So let's go to this Mars, Rahu, Venus. We've got Venus being shamed by Mars. What quotes have we got from Ian Fleming's life? He was a serial womanizer, chain smoked and drank heavily. So we've got here serial womanizer, Venus as a generic indicator of beautiful women and of love, and also of indulgences. And he smoked heavily and drank as well. So definitely got some Venus stuff going on here. He and his wife regularly beat each other. So what a thing to put in the article, but yes, it's true. And there are these letters where they speak about that. So this violence of Mars having this Rahu unpredictable effect inside the marriage. When asked about his similarities with the James Bond character, he replied, "I certainly haven't got his very lively appetites." However, Fleming's sexual appetite was every bit as vociferous or voracious as 007's. No one I have ever known had sex on the brain as much as Ian, said a girlfriend, Lady Mary Pakenham. So there's the person who is a member of British society writing a character who has these this outrageous lifestyle, and has a different woman in every port, very exciting kind of life full of these affairs and romances. And when asked publicly, he denies that that's what his life is like, but privately his friends tell a different story. So this is a kind of that shame thing, where the thing that we're trying to hide, we're going to deny when asked about it in public. While he was at this military training college as a young man, he caught a sexually transmitted disease from a prostitute, and his mother forced him to resign from the army. So, this got some great Venus things in it with the sex and the prostitute, and then it's got the army with the Mars. So wonderful use of this Avasthas. Outside the bedroom, he preferred the company of men, whom he described as the only real human beings. Women were there to be chased and bedded and then discarded. So you can see this very broken relationship with the concept of Venus, the pure concept of Venus. His attitude to the opposite sex was built on feelings of disgust and inadequacy at the consequences of catching this sexually transmitted disease. So we can see how everything's gotten wrapped up together, creating this shame and then gone out to play itself in his life. So an excellent example of the shame of desires. And that brings us to Saturn, the shame of flaws. Perhaps the planet most suited, I don't know, Venus is a top contender, Saturn's a top contender as well. Shame of not meeting standards, of not being good enough, shame of being natural. What is this great gift of Saturn? It's being natural, authentic, and the shame of just being naturally oneself. For this example, I'm choosing Mariah Carey, who has her ascendant in Taurus, a moon in Cancer, Jupiter and Ketu in Libra, Mars in Sagittarius, Mercury in Pisces, and then what we're looking for, she has Rahu, Sun, Venus and Saturn. And what I want to pick on for this example is the Sun shaming Saturn by being with Rahu and Saturn. So what does this play out in her life? How does it play out? This is from an article in the BBC. The singer was diagnosed with bipolar in 2001. Until recently, I have lived in denial and isolation and in constant fear someone would expose me, she explained. What a fantastic quote describing the experience of trying to hide one's flaws. So this bipolar being perceived as a flaw, especially by the Sun, this person has an enormous persona. It's contributing so much through her artistry. To have this flaw, she wants to hide it away. She's living in constant fear. What a Saturn experience. I would feel so lonely and sad, even guilty that I wasn't doing what I needed to be doing for my career. So again, that Sun beaming out there, wanting to be invincible, wanting to be that light, and yet actually what she's feeling is lonely and sad. Some more great Saturn words. And here she's used the word guilt, but this shame that I'm not being that Sun energy. So fantastic example of our final face of shame. And one more. It was too heavy a burden to carry. I simply couldn't do that anymore. These are just wonderful Saturn words. Too heavy a burden. Yeah. So that's the Saturn face of shame. Now, can we use the shamed Avasthas with Karakas? Because often we think of the Lajjitaadi Avasthas as being the inner psychological experience for the person. And it is very much that. And especially shame is absolutely happening inside the person, and we may not know. And in fact, in the research I did for this chart, for this video, there were many, many charts that met the criteria. There were many examples where I could say, oh yeah, I can see that pattern playing out. But then there are other examples where you're like, oh, I don't see that. And we may never know because, well, maybe the timing also never triggered this experience to happen, or it's such an internal experience that we won't know. We'll never know. It's something the person takes to their grave. But we can use it as Karakas for, in this case, I'm going to explore husband and wife, two different Karakas, but health and other aspects of astrology as well. So let's have a look at that. So let's look at the example of Jupiter being a Karaka for husbands. And we're bringing back Yoko Ono's chart here because we know that we've got happening in there in Virgo, we've got Mars shaming Jupiter because of having Ketu in the same sign. And what are the dynamics that are important here? When it's Mars being the planet who's shaming, we know that it's going to be about right and wrong because Mars is very idealistic. So the person's going to be doing the right thing, but their husband is going to bring shame. Like just being married to that person or in a relationship with that person is going to create shame. And of course, with Yoko Ono, we already discussed that here is someone whose Jupiter is trying to do good in the world. That's a clear motivation that she has. And actually, she has done good in the world. She's made a lot of contributions and she's created foundations and scholarships. This person has definitely devoted her life to improving the goodness in the world. And yet, because of her husband, she will only ever be associated as being the person who broke up the Beatles, which is not a truth. It's just a made-up press story, but that's her identity. And the widow, so here's a woman, an independent activist who's known as for being a widow. But let's find out a little bit more about her life. Because, for example, did you know that she's been married 3 times and that she lost custody of a child? And I think we can see that with this being with Ketu, we are expecting that to have an impact on the Jupiter Karakas, like husbands and children. So has she lost husbands? Yes. Has she lost children? Yes. When she gets together with John Lennon, she's the one that's being pursued by a married man. She's actually single and available. He's married. So if anybody's doing anything wrong, it's him, but actually she gets the shame. So isn't it good to see how powerful these shamed Avasthas are? Once she's married, she's accused of breaking up the Beatles, and she can't share or display any joy from being a bride. There's no glow here, no cover of glamorous magazines. It's shame. If she says anything, it's perceived badly. And then, okay, this is really fascinating. That then actually the Beatles have ended. John and Yoko have moved to New York. They're living together. Theoretically now, this is peace. They've made it. They are safely at shore, having experienced this enormous storm of their relationship and the publicity. But actually, when we have these Avasthas, they create inside of us the propensity to create these experiences. So here she has it all, but she's feeling stifled. This is how the story goes. We're not inside people's homes or their heads. So, this is all bits and pieces that are the way people tell the story. But that John is very devoted. It's just the two of them. She wants more space. She wants him to feel more free and spacious, but he just wants to be only with her. And so she orchestrates this affair with their personal assistant. And he moves out of the apartment. He lives with this assistant in Los Angeles. And Yoko calls every day and, according to the assistant, is quite controlling of, how they should be seen and what they should say to the press. So this is very much something that she's involved in. And I find that fascinating because of how much anyone is a victim of their own shamed Avasthas, that sometimes these things happen to people, and sometimes these people are involved in what's happening to them, regardless of whether it happens to them or they make it happen in their life. It is there in the astrology, and so we must respect the power of these resonating energies that can create, mayhem, turn our lives upside down just in order to satisfy the energy of this kind of combination. So having orchestrated or contrived this situation, she now gets to be the shamed spouse. Her husband is bringing shame to her by having an affair, which is very public, the other side of the country. It's his lost weekend. This is not some kind of secret to the press. So she's now playing this role of the shamed spouse. How powerful these Avasthas are. And then, of course, she loses her husband to a violent death, which I'm just putting that in there because of the Mars K2 with Jupiter situation. And as we said at the beginning, this independent woman she becomes famous first as a band wrecker and then for somebody's widow. Her own work, her own contribution, her own voice, it's sidelined. And we see that with Mars there representing the right and wrongs of society, those views having their effect on the way she's perceived. And even her husband doesn't acknowledge her with songwriting credits. Lennon later stated his regrets about feeling guilty enough to give McCartney credit as co-writer on my first independent single instead of giving it to Yoko, who had actually written it with me. So even the good that she's doing with her husband, he's shamed into not representing her, of not treating her as an equal. And these are the shames that are private, that we can't know how that felt. But this is a great example of Jupiter, the husband, being shamed by Mars. Now, what about the other way around? What about Venus being shamed by Mars? Because we can use Venus to represent the wife in a heterosexual male chart. So here we've got a new example. Garth Brooks, ascendant in Gemini, Rahu in Leo, whole lot of space, and then an enormous lineup of planets in Aquarius. We've got Venus, we've got Jupiter, we've got Sun, Ketu, Mercury, Mars and Saturn, and Moon just there in Pisces. So once again, we see here a lot of planets going on. I picked this example when I put it in the database. I put in, could I please see Venus with a node with one of these pure malefics, and out come Garth Brooks. And I remembered reading something years ago about he had an affair or something, so I was like, great, let's pick this. And then when I looked at the chart, I went, wow, that is rather a lot going on. But let's talk about what do we know about what we're going to see here. Again, the person is going to be doing the right thing, because that is Mars ideals. But the person has feelings of love, Venus, or they have a wife, Venus, or a mistress that brings them into conflict with the right thing. So they're feeling shame. Let's have a look at Garth Brooks. He's married in the mid-80s. And he explains, being married, it's got to be right. Great Mars statement there for us. This is who you went to college with, and you were married in front of God and your family and everything. Okay, so what a Mars-laden statement that is. This is like, I am going to conquer any feelings that I have. This is the right thing. I'm going to use discipline. I'm going to use my sense of right and wrong to honor this college girlfriend that I've married. I've done exactly the right thing. But then the universe has such a good sense of humor that in 1987, he happens to be introduced to a young woman by a friend. When this young woman left, the friend goes, "What did you think?" And Garth Brooks says, "Well, it's strange because I felt that feeling like when you just met your wife, but I've been married for 13 months. So how amazing is that here Venus, that helps us make decisions that lead to higher fulfillment. We get next to the right person, and this Venus goes off and we feel it and we know in ourselves, this is the person I'm supposed to be married to. But straight away we overlay on top of that the right and the wrongs. But I'm already married. I've made these vows in front of God and all of my family. I've married the college sweetheart, which is exactly what you're supposed to do. I'm having children with her, like I am duty bound to stay with her. So the perfect Venus being shamed by Mars, love bringing us into shameful situation. And Brooks went on to explain that he didn't make a move because he was committed to his vows, but didn't exactly paint his marriage in a good light. He said, so you keep hacking and you work and you work and you work, and then it comes that time when you're looking at the rest of your life and going, how do I want to live it? So you can see that it's really that toughness of Mars. You know, these are what the malefics are great for, right? They get us through tough situations. He keeps doing the work and keeps taking the actions to keep this marriage going when he inside of himself knows it's wrong. But those ideals are keeping him going. So are there any potential gifts from these shamed Avasthas? Just looking at the examples that we've had a chance to today, picking up on Garth Brooks, we've got Venus being shamed by Mars with K2. So we know that it's going to separate us from love. It's going to separate us from desires, separate us from women, from wives. But that this experience in this lifetime has actually taught Garth Brooks that love has nothing to do with right and wrong. And he's been able to separate those from being bound together as they were in that Avasthas, because after many, many years of being with his wife and raising his children, he does separate. The woman that he met way back in 87, she also separates, and they both divorce from their spouses, and then they get together and married, and apparently now they're very happy. So this profound experience, you know, I could almost feel the soma myself, that he had that resonance of this is the woman I should be married to, is kept alive all of this time, and eventually teaches him this softness that, you know, love has nothing to do with right and wrong. It's not to be tamed and controlled and suppressed by our ideals. And Yoko Ono, that combination of Jupiter, K2, Mars, perhaps what that is teaching us is that Jupiter's contentment, its sense of goodness, of the goodness that is in life, that is beyond being wronged. That there are naturally, in this crazy time that we live in, there are naturally things that go wrong. One cannot hang one's contentment on right and wrong being lived out perfectly in this world that we live in. So separating Jupiter from right and wrong. And let's throw in John Lennon, because we had a look at him twice as well, that he's got Sun, Rahu, Mars, he's got Mars, Rahu, Sun. So both Sun being shamed by Mars and also Mars being shamed by Sun. And yet here he is through his lifetime discovering that love and peace are the answer to violence. And how important is that intense constellation, you know, those experiences, two malefic planets with a node. Imagine that childhood, imagine that adolescence, and grappling with that the visceral, somatic nature of shame has really allowed this person to contribute greatly to peace on the planet. So maybe there are gifts for us in the shamed Avasthas, or gifts for those who have shamed Avasthas. Final thoughts, just in case I haven't covered them enough. The shamed Avasthas look different with Rahu, with Ketu, and with the fifth house. So one of the things I really enjoy when I'm researching someone's chart is when you've been through it all, you've looked at all the indicators, and you step back and you think, what is this chart really giving the opportunity to experience, to teach, to learn? And with the shamed Avasthas, as we talked about on the previous screen, where can this client access the learning of this Avasthas? If it's Garth Brooks, you know, learning about love and right and wrong. If it's Yoko Ono, learning about goodness beyond being wronged. If it's John Lennon, looking at peace, the goodness of peace, my vision, my good vision being beyond violence, and that anyone who's violent can be a voice for peace and beacon for peace. So I love looking for those meanings, but I don't have time today to go through each of these shamed combinations with you. But in each of these, we need to ask ourselves, is there something that the person is trying to learn here? It's like I think Ashamed Avasthas is like a post-it note from a previous lifetime saying, this is really important, don't miss this. There's a lesson here for you. There's something here. And by making it so visceral and so somatic, the person is not going to miss it. They're not going to have the chance to not confront that. Okay, we talked about that the shame avasthas may make someone create their own shame in their life. And that perhaps that's what's very freeing about astrology, is that the person themselves is like, why would I do that? How can I have done that? And astrology is like, well, those energies were so profound, so powerful that, they exerted force upon you. So it helps us to get even more space, be even more objective. Don't worry about the blame game. Just begin to see the pattern and start pulling apart the players so that we can slow down our reaction times and change our reaction. And knowing that it's in your chart can give comfort and empowerment, especially around this shouldn't have happened. So we talked about the shame that's created when someone violates you for no reason, like you cannot fathom a reason, and so you think it's a flaw inside of yourself. There's some target on you that has created this. Knowing that it's in your chart lets you know that, inverted commas, it was supposed to happen. It was not random. There's something here for us to learn in this situation. And that can be really empowering, getting away from the why and that rabbit hole of why, and also getting away from the blame of he did it or I did it or she did it. It's just, it happened. It's right there in the chart. So this objectivity is so helpful. So explaining to a client the shamed avasthas in their chart can help the client bring light to an area of darkness in their life. And this goes back to that Brene Brown quote from the beginning, that shame needs secrecy. It's 100% diet, must have access to secrecy. If we can bring light to this situation, it would begin to take away the power from shame. So like we discussed, it can relieve the shame or guilt of this shouldn't have happened, because it's right there in the chart. So it was going to happen. Whether he did it or you did it or she did it, that dynamic was going to play out somewhere because there's a learning there. It can help the person untangle the complexity of a hidden experience, a pattern that keeps happening that they can't see all the players in the pattern. Astrology is great for objectifying that, putting the planets in the space you can see it outside of yourself. It can bring language and context to that somatic or triggered response, and that will buy you time and space to respond differently. It can promote the person into achieving something great. And look at the cases that we've studied today. John Lennon, this inspirational peace story. Pink has created an army of outcasts, people who felt that their lives, that they were separate from everybody. And what has she done? With Mercury being shamed, when she's overcome it, she's connected people, validating that their experiences are real, their feelings are real, and they are valid as people. So Ashamed Avasthas can create greatness. And when it's healed, the shamed Avasthas creates in the person an empathy for humanity that is authentic and profound. Because in order to heal any shamed Avasthas, one has to find the empathy for oneself, first thing, and one has to overcome the fear of reconnecting fully with life. We can't hide away from life anymore. And when someone does that consciously and allows life to rush back into their heart, they have so much to give to others who are in the same situation. So I hope you have enjoyed the video today. My final video for year 4. I look forward to sharing other videos with you in the future. I hope you will come and subscribe to my channel and watch my videos as we go through the years. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Shamed Avashta. Do you have one in your chart? Do you see them in your clients' charts? And which of those faces of shame do you see or do you struggle with? Is it the shame around inspirations, around facilitating things and ending up being an obstruction to things? Is it the shame of desires or lack, or of your goodness, your futility, or your neediness? Get to know those faces of shame and help clients and unpack these rejected experiences. Really looking forward to seeing you in the future. Best wishes.